All right, welcome back everyone. Today's topic is on multi-distance spatial cluster analysis, or the Ripley's K function. That's a lot to talk about. So what's going on is that this is different than what we did before, in that we have the opportunity now to find specifically where that clustering or dispersion is occurring across our study area. So what we're going to do in this exercise for this topic is to analyze the spatial pattern over a range of distances. So this is an area of the West Virginia Research Forest. And for this particular study area plot, we have aerial imagery that was used to create these canopy delineations. So each one of those yellow polygons represents the crown of a tree. And for each one of those tree crowns, field work was done to identify that particular tree species. So the spatial question, the spatial statistical question, is to determine if there is any type of dispersion or clustering occurring regarding these species. So if there are certain species that are clustering naturally in a certain area, that can help in terms of forest management, in terms of timber production, timber management. It can also help with wildlife, ecological studies, and so on. So it's an important question to answer and to try to figure out for this study area. This is what the imagery looks like in the fall. And again, we can drop those polygons over top of it as well. So the classification of these polygons, again, was done using field work for each one of these sites. Okay, so one of the things we're going to do first with this particular data set is we're going to determine where are the points, the centroids, because those centroids are what are being used in the spatial statistics when you have inputs as polygons. So the feature to point command enables us to see where those points fall within each one of those polygons for each of the tree crowns. So when we do that, we get something like this. That shows for each one of the points where the polygon boundary is. So you can see up here, here's one that's a very large tree crown, very large tree, or it could be a combination of multiple trees in there, depending upon how the delineation worked. Here's the other one's very large, and some other small ones around here. So one of the things I want to mention first is that it's very important to look at the distribution of your polygons that are being used to create these centroids. If a lot of them are very large and some of them are small, if they vary widely, that will mean that you're not going to probably get the most accurate spatial statistics as you would if all the polygons were the same general size and shape. If you remember last time when we looked at those counties throughout the Appalachian region, for the most part, those counties were pretty similar in size. And I would say that in looking at this, we have some large polygons in terms of these tree crowns, but they're mostly pretty close in size. But again, what we would want to do is open that attribute table in GIS and look at the min, the max, the mean, standard deviation of each of these polygons to determine if it has too much variation in it that could effectively be used and could be a potential problem when looking at the spatial statistics, because especially with this Ripley's K function, we're looking at distances from each point to surrounding points. These are the different species names. And so the different species names are kind of difficult to see here because there's only so many colors that we can effectively decipher. So it might be best to look at these attributes for the polygons for each of the tree canopies for each of the sites and just look at the distribution. So you can do this by different colors and or picking out one particular species at a time. All right, so the spatial statistic we're going to use today is called the K function. Now the K function, it counts the number of features within defined distances. It has some advantages and it has some disadvantages. Disadvantages, as you can see here, is part of this little table. So the main disadvantage is that those patterns are suspect at larger distances due to edge effects. So let's go back here for a second. And what I mean by that is that just because this is an edge, it kind of unfairly underrepresents the adjacent sites that could be outside of this edge. So the edge effects are one of the problems and limitations in using this K function. However, there's ways to get around that. It does have some advantages in terms of being able to calculate the concentration of features at a range of distances or scales. So the big reason why this is important is because we can look at this K function and use a distance band that is important or significant for some ecological reason or some social reason or whatever. So this distance band that we look at and use can be set for a particular distance, and the amount of clustering or dispersion within that can be investigated. So this is a comparison of the methods for measuring those patterns of feature locations. The nearest neighbor index, remember that was the first topic we had in this class. That used the z-score. It also considered distances between features, as the K function does. And the average nearest neighbor disadvantage was that the results could be biased because of the edge around that study area. So again, this edge effect is definitely something we have to take into account and consider for our analysis. The K function was similar to the average nearest neighbor in that we're not using essentially a value for the points. We're using the raw point locations by themselves. And so a lot of times this K function is used with categorical data, such as the trees example species that we're using in this exercise. I like this graphic because I think this does a pretty good job explaining what's going on with these distance bands. So this might be a little tricky to see, but these points are representative of the same type of pattern. And these circles that you see are distance bands that are moving to each of the individual points in this display. And they're looking at how many particular neighbors or features are within these different bands. So again, these black points, it's the same distribution. And now I'm just showing that with these distance bands for this point, this one's for this point, this one's down for this point. So as you can see, as you go around these different distance bands, there's more or less points within this complete extent. And so the K function measures that, calculates those, and it finds the average number of those neighboring features within each of those distances. If the average number of features at a distance is greater than the average concentration, then it's considered to be clustered at that distance. This is the great graph that makes the analysis of this pretty easy and also gives you your result. So the multi-distance spatial cluster analysis, Ripley's K function, determines whether those features or the values associated with those features are statistically significant clustering or dispersion over a range of distances. So inside of this confidence interval, we don't look at values within this, inside of this confidence interval, the upper and lower, because they're not statistically significant. Outside of this confidence envelope, which is be outside here and outside here, that's where we want to examine areas and values for. And the values we get for areas that are outside of this confidence interval, as you can see, there's one point here, there's another point here, another one here, another one up here. If we come down and look at those distances, this is distance on this axis, this is a z-score on this axis, even though it's not labeled. And so if it's above this expected random spatial pattern line, we have a clustered pattern. If it's below it, down here, we have a dispersed pattern. So again, nothing matters here inside of these dashed lines of the confidence envelope. We're looking for locations outside that confidence envelope. All right, so again, this is a statistically significant cluster at smaller values, lower distances, and this is a statistically significant dispersion at larger distances. Okay? And those specific distances in which we start to see the clustered pattern go away occur at this distance, about 215. Where we start to see a dispersion pattern occur looks like about 265 and all the way up to like 365. So in looking at this graphic, we would conclude that we have a dispersed pattern of our distribution between 265 and 365. We have a statistically significant cluster distribution between the distance of 40 and looks like about 215. Okay? That's how we read this, that's how we interpret this, and that's how we get distances in which where that clustered or where that dispersed pattern is occurring. That's the major take-home from the K function. So again, it's similar to the average nearest neighbor. It gives a measure of the clustering or dispersion using the distance of points between them. It's different, though, in that it includes all neighbors within that distance, rather than the distance to each feature, like the single nearest neighbor did. It's really good, the K function is, if you're interested in how those patterns are changing at different scales of analysis. So at certain scales, you might be able to see things, or they might disappear. So the changing scales, those changing distances, really can have effect on what we're looking at regarding dispersion or clustering. Again, those are the two main things we're looking for, is dispersion and clustering in our analysis. Let's see, includes all distances to neighbors within a given distance, so we have the opportunity to set those given distances. And examples include emergency calls, bird nests, things in which there's relationships or specific distances which we're interested in finding. I'm not going to get into the math for this. There's a bunch of things you can read about this and check out in more detail. But essentially what's happening is we're finding the distance from each point to every other point. Then for each point, we're counting the number of surrounding points within that distance. Okay, so essentially this is our expected line. This is our confidence envelope. Things outside of that confidence envelope is what we're determining is going to be our clustered or random pattern. This is what we have observed with our distribution. And so the areas that are above that expected line, outside the confidence envelope, are statistically significant clustering. And areas that are below are statistically significant dispersion occurring. So dispersion, things are forcing things to be dispersed. Things are repelling each other. Just the opposite, clustering, things are getting pulled together. Again, the most important thing about this is we can find those distances in which that clustering is occurring. Between 100, it looks like about maybe 50 here. And then between 110 maybe, and up here to like 160, we're seeing dispersion. This is an example of a paper that uses the K function. A lot of forestry related papers for tree species, wildlife studies use K function. And so this is what those K functions look like that were calculated in this particular application. And so you can see these distances specifically, just like I was pointing out here. I said the 110 up to like 160 are also being found for these particular species using these envelopes and cutoff threshold points. So you see those distances that are being examined and pulled out from these particular Ripley's K function graphs. The factors that influence the K function are points near the edge. This is a major problem because if you're near the edge, you don't want to artificially be calculated as a cluster just because you're on the edge and you don't inherently have any boundaries or points that are outside of that study area extent. So what we can do is a bunch of things to kind of account for that. This is what the tool looks like in ArcGIS Pro, multi-distance spatial cluster analysis, Ripley's K function. Let me just show you where that is real quick here. It's in our analysis tools, and we can see under the analyzing patterns, the multi-distance spatial cluster analysis. The boundary correction method, so that's right here, boundary correction method. We always want to specify a boundary correction method. A bunch of things we can do. We can have a simulated outer boundary. We can reduce the area. So this is an example of simulating the outer boundary. So essentially it takes a mirror of these points, as you can see here, and it drops them outside. This point gets mirrored out here, this point gets mirrored here, and so on. So that's one way. It's essentially saying that this outer boundary distribution of points, we'll just mirror that out here. And so that way the points then have an edge that's similar to where their current locations are. That's one option. Another thing you can do is if you have a lot of points, you can reduce that analysis area. So again, these points on the edge are biased because they don't have a boundary. You can actually go inside of that, and so you're going to be missing some points, but it is a way to reduce your analysis extent and address this boundary issue. All right, so what we've done so far, we've assessed overall spatial patterns with average nearest neighbor. Our main question there was that are the features randomly located throughout the study area, or are they displaying some type of clustered or dispersed pattern? That's the first thing we did in topic 1. Topic 2, we looked at the GEDIS or general G statistic. In this case, we were able to use a value, an attribute value for those point locations to determine if the higher values were clustering or if they were dispersed. So we had a bunch of the groundwater data and other data sets for the Appalachian Regional Commission that we used for that. Then this time the K function is our topic, and we're in the lab exercise we're going to be looking at these tree species locations and determine whether those features, those values are associated with them, are statistically significant in having clustering or dispersion over different distances, and then also finding out what that distance is. So not only are we finding the dispersion and the clustering pattern, but we're finding what is statistically significant. So getting back to what we used before, essentially this area that we're seeing here is statistically significant. That would be the areas outside that you can see here of the random area in the middle. So this would be considered our random area in the middle, just like this was before. And we're looking for these significant locations. This is significant, and how they report as clustered or dispersed patterns. All right, so let's see. A couple things I just want to highlight for you on this lab exercise data set. So this is the tree canopy data. We can open up the attribute table, and like I said, check out these areas, and we can look at statistics for these to determine their min, their max, their range. As you can see here, standard deviation, okay? As well as we can look at information regarding these attributes for the different species types. These are the common names. This is the species name, and this is the common name we can look at. So we can do statistics also on these common names. We can also summarize this information. So if we look at our common names for these species, and let's just say we're interested in looking at statistics for this particular field, and we want to find for the field maybe just a count of the different types of names that exist. So we're just going to look at the common names. We could also maybe do a summarization of area of each of these if we wanted to. But as part of this just first run, I'm just going to show you quickly how to summarize how many different types of species we have throughout the study area. So this creates an output table, which looks like this, which gives us some really good information based upon that frequency score. We can see that yellow poplar occurs in 348 of these different polygons. There's 26 different types. Next highest frequency is the red maples, white oaks, and so on. So it's really good to explore this data a little bit, as I just showed you with some basic statistics of the polygon sizes, as well as the attributes. And it's also important to come in here and you can do a symbology to look at this distribution as well. So maybe instead of a single symbol, I want to do unique values. And for the unique values, we use those common names. And you get an idea of the distribution that way. So if there was a particular species you just kind of wanted to look at to see what this looked like, let's just say I change this to a color like that. You can see those chestnut oaks. I would think spatially, based upon just my eye vision of this, they look pretty dispersed. Might be some clusters that you see a little bit. For the most part, they're pretty dispersed throughout that area. So what does that mean ecologically, or in terms of forest management, or even for different wildlife purposes for these different species, based upon your study area site and what you have? So a lot of really interesting kind of management questions can develop off of what we're seeing with these clustering or dispersed patterns, and then also more specifically the distance that they're occurring. So that's the main thing you're going to use in this exercise. All right, let me just drag that exercise over for a second just to highlight a couple things. All right, so this is exercise 3. Okay, so just like I did, you're going to open up this tree canopy shapefile. What is the most common species? Explain how you did that with that summarize tool. How many different white oak polygon tree canopies are present in the study area? So things you can analyze with that table, you can answer with this particular question. And then down here is where we're actually going to be using that Ripley's K function. You're going to look for clustering or dispersion for those particular species. And then you're also going to be looking at the distances in which they're occurring. And so make sure you go down here and run these using the parameters I have set for you right here. 50 distance spans, the permutations, and you're going to be checking those display results graphically. And we're going to choose simulate outer boundary, which was the example I showed you here, where we're simulating the outer boundary. We essentially take a mirror of what we have to say that our boundary was going to be very similar to what we already have in our extent. That pattern will continue, so we can use that as an outer boundary. Okay, give that a shot. If you have any questions, let me know. And that is topic 3, Ripley's K function, and exercise 3.